bring scholars from different areas and people from outside the scholarly community, policymakers, publics, and so forth, to discuss what we think are critical issues in relation to health and well-being, but issues that we also want to use methods and skills from the humanities and social sciences to begin to understand and address. We chose to focus in this seminar on Italian well-being because we are working with the WHO to work out ways in which countries within the European region in particular can report on well-being. It's very standard to report on health and disease in relation to country profiles. Reporting on well-being is new. The WHO expect it from their member states, but we are not quite sure how to do it. And so they've tasked us with demonstrating through Mauro and our partners such as Adolfo, asked us to show or to produce a template, a way of doing it, to show how it can be done. For a variety of reasons, we chose Italy, partly because of skills, partly because the regional committee in WHO Europe Regional Committee is in Rome in September, and also partly because Italy has a deep wealth of statistical information about well-being, and that's down to the work that Adolfo has been doing. So we're going to hear from Mauro and Adolfo later. I'm going to ask Felicity Thomas, who's co-director of the WHO Centre, to talk a little bit about where this came from and the work on well-being, because Felicity is much more closely involved than I am in some of the committee work on reporting on well-being, the indicators that the WHO use. So Felicity is going to say something first, then I'm going to hand over to Mauro, who will chair most of the discussion, and Mauro and Adolfo's presentations. Felicity.
Okay, thank you, Mark. You've just said most of what I was going to say. Anyway, so I'll keep this very brief. But just to recap what Mark was saying, countries across the WHO European region, and this is a vast region of 53 very, very diverse countries. For some time now, they've actually been required to produce country-level profiles on health and a smaller highlights on health report that accompanies that. These country-level reports are supposed to give an overview of the country's health status, describing things like mortality, morbidity, and exposure to key risks and trends. The reports are developed as a collaboration between WHO and the member states, and where possible, they draw on data, on agreed data sets that the whole region can use. Now, obviously, that can be quite limiting in some respects because we're talking about very diverse countries, and not all the countries have all of the data. So they try their best to try and find data that can work across different countries to enable comparisons not only over time, but also across the region as well. Now, Health 2020, which is the policy framework for health across the European region, has identified the enhancement of well-being as a really key target of health policies. And this is where this is kind of coming from. So member states are now required to start to report on health and well-being. There have been a few reports come out so far that have been called country profiles on health and well-being, but actually the well-being sections are very, very underdeveloped at the moment. And this is where the work that we're doing comes in. A core and additional set of indicators has been agreed by WHO to measure well-being. These are both objective and subjective indicators, and I think Mauro and Adolfo will tell us more about these later. What we're trying to do, as Mark said, is put together a template to help countries to think about how they can effectively report on well-being to add to their health profiles. What we're also trying to do is look a little bit beyond the data that WHO collects as their sort of core and additional indicators to see what kind of statistics are available within each country as well, to help ensure that there's some sort of cultural relevance to the reports that get written. We're not trying to just sort of provide a standardized report for every country. It's about trying to tweak each country so that it actually reflects what people within each country see as being important to their own health and well-being. So over to Adolfo. Thank you. Mauro, you go first. Sorry, Adolfo's up there.
Yeah, no, it's the priorities.
Hello everyone and welcome. We start with the first presentation with Adolfo Morrone, who is a senior researcher, who was a senior researcher at ISTAT, and he was one of the initiators of the well-being indicators in Italy. Currently, Adolfo is a professor at the Università Pontificia in Rome. And I said in Italian because it sounds a bit more exotic, but we got the translation there. And also, importantly, Adolfo worked on with the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, or OECD. You will hear a lot in the course of this presentation, this OECD and ISTAT, and he had a deep involvement in measurement of well-being. So, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. As Mauro said, my perspective on well-being is a perspective of a researcher that worked in National Statistical Office. So all that you will hear in this presentation is from this point of view. I say this because the perspective of a National Statistical Office is a very tight one. I mean, when you think about what to measure and how to measure, you have to think in the perspective of producing indicators that can match the quality criteria of a National Statistical Office. And also the source of data that you will use in this process must be official sources of data. So in all the work that has been done by ISTAT, but also by the OECD, by Eurostat, the National Statistical Office in UK, I mean, you have this tight constraint. This means that when you want to think about indicators, you have to exclude methods that are not considered to the standard of the official statistics. So this is a very precise perspective. For the sake of this seminar, of course, well-being, we can talk a lot about well-being, how to measure it. So I was asked to give an overview of the Italian BEST project. Later I will explain what does BEST mean. But mainly also to give a little bit of perspective between this discussion between objective indicators and subjective indicators. So my presentation will be divided in two parts. The first part that is mainly methodological to explain what do we mean by objective versus subjective indicators. And the second part we start with a very brief historical history of the well-being movement, and then I will focus on the Italian case. So let's see if it works. Okay. So let's start with the definition and conceptual issues. We work a lot on this because there is a big debate about objective and subjective indicators, but it's not always very clear what do we mean by objective and subjective indicators. So very often we have this problem that when we talk about objective and subjective, we consider this discussion equivalent to quantitative and qualitative. And this is completely wrong. And so I will try to frame a little bit better what from this point of view. So when I talk about objective and subjective, we are talking about the different component of the reality. So this has also been discussed by the Stiglitz Commission, by the OECD, and now there is let's say an agreement that objective and subjective are two different perspectives with which we measure reality, and they are complementary. So objective gives some information, subjective give other information, and have to put the things together to get a full picture. So objective versus subjective is attained to the question of what we are going to observe. Of course, so we are dealing with component of reality, so we are dealing with information. So we can say that objective data can be collected by observing the reality, while subjective indicators are collected only from individuals and their assertions. So this is already a big difference, and this is why you seldom hear about subjective indicators in some science like physics or climate. But you hear about subjective indicators so when the science work with people, for example, economy, or even health or sociology. So we already said this, objective are erroneously referred as quantitative, while subjective are referred as qualitative. While we can say more precisely that when we talk about indicators, objective indicators, we can say that are based upon explicit criteria, and these criteria are shared by external observers. For example, when we talk about the employment rate, there is a very clear, at least at the European level, definition of what is an employed person. It's a person that has worked at least 1 hour in the reference period, according to Eurostat definition. And these are objective criteria. While subjective are mainly based upon subjective evaluation and implicit criteria that can be different from individual to individual. We will see this with an example. So, having said that, we can also try to clarify another aspect. The methodological approach to measure objective and subjective can be quantitative or qualitative. And this attains to in which way we are going to observe the reality. So this is a completely different perspective. When we put together the two aspects, we can have a situation like this, where you have objective versus subjective and qualitative versus quantitative. And to sum up, we can say that objective versus subjective is about what we are going to observe, while qualitative versus quantitative is in which way we observe. These are examples of objective data at macro level, and most of these are very well known, like health system, energy system, income distribution, disparities, informal networks. These are all objective data. We have objective data also at the micro level. Sex, age are very famous. I mean, as standard measures, civil, marital status, birthplace, housing. Oh. Okay. Oh. Sorry. Wait. Maybe. Okay. What else?
Sorry about this. For some reason it's logged you out.
So they are not hearing us anymore.
Yeah, it's fine. We can just get you back in again now. It's a few seconds.
Okay. Why?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. While these are example of subjective indicators and can be about abilities, capacities, or personal traits, or even sentiments. For example, about the sentiments, we can make an example that is pretty famous in the debate about the evaluations and perception. We have subjective well-being. Subjective well-being that can be measured, taking into consideration the global level, and this is the overall satisfaction or life satisfaction is very important indicators of the well-being debate, or can be measured at specific level. In this case, we have satisfaction in different domains. So you can have satisfaction for economic condition, health condition, relationship, and so on and so forth. And this is, can I go back?
Yeah.
The arrow.
Yeah, it's just the, yeah.
So in this case, we are in the case of sentiment, attitudes, and evaluations. While if I want to measure the affective components of subjective well-being, then I have to measure a completely different aspect, and these are the pleasant affects like happiness, feelings, self-determination, and unpleasant affects like worries, losing self-confidence, and so on and so forth. Of course, these are a different level of complexity when you want to measure for the sake of official statistics. This level is much easier to measure, and we have in fact, we have harmonized statistics on life satisfaction international level. This level is much more difficult. So, and you seldom have data that can be compared between countries. Having said that, this sum up a little bit the debate that has been carried on in the last 15 years about measuring well-being and the complexity of measuring well-being. Here is a very brief history of the well-being movement. So if we start with the GDP that has been developed by Kuznets in 1934, we see the main important moment of this movement. We have in the 60s, we have the beginning of the social indicators movement, but we can say that we have different other movement, but we can say that really the discussion about well-being started around 2006, 2005, 2006. First with the Istanbul Declaration and the global project carried on by the OECD on measuring the progress of societies. Then we have Bhutan that developed its gross national happiness, and a landmark is the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report on measurement of economic performance and social progress of 2009. This was a report that was requested by the French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and Stiglitz and Fitoussi worked on it with the collaboration of many other people, among the others the OECD. And they were the first to say that we cannot only focus on GDP, but we have to complement the GDP with other measures that focus more on the people. But you cannot only focus on the economic aspect, you also have to focus on other aspects which are mainly quality of life and the environment. So they were the first to say that you need a more multidimensional picture. And then you have the other deadlines. 2009, the Commission released the GDP and Beyond, the European Commission, measuring progress in a changing world. 2010, UK announces the Big Society and Wellbeing Project, and you have different resolution of the UN, mainly focus on the use of happiness indicators for the policy. 2011 is the Better Life Initiative, House Life of the OECD. And 2013, Italy launched BEST project, and now we have 2015 Eurostat released quality of life indicators and so on. I mean, mainly the OECD initiative, the UK initiative, the Italian initiative, the Stiglitz report, they all agree that when you measure well-being, you have to consider both objective and subjective indicators. You cannot have a full picture of the reality if you are stick on measuring only objective data. Even though you are not focusing only on the economic side, but you enlarge the picture to other domains, you have to focus also on subjective data. So the best project stands for benessere equo e sostenibile, which means in English equitable and sustainable well-being. So it has three components: the well-being that measure the situation now, the equity that measure the disparity in this situation, so how the well-being is distributed among Italy, and is this well-being sustainable, that measure the amount in time. The BEST has 12 domains. 9 domains are main outcome. You can see here the domains. So some are pretty straightforward. You find in all these initiatives like health, work, economic well-being. Others are more specific of the Italian case, like landscape and cultural heritage, subjective well-being. And 3 domains are drivers of well-being. So these are not main outcome, but are recognized to be drivers that can improve the well-being of the Italian society. Starting from these 12 domains, we developed with the help of a huge scientific commission, we developed around 130 indicators to measure the different aspects of well-being. I say around 130 indicators because this is a work in progress, so every year the indicators are improved. So if the other source of data become available, we improve the indicator, we change the indicator, trying to always to keep the state of the art of the indicators. And among these 130 indicators, these are the subjective measures that we use in BES. I focus here only on the main one. We have also other subjective indicators, but these are. So you can see that for health, we use quite a lot subjective indicators because we have the healthy life expectancy at birth. We have two indicators, one of physical stages, one of the mental stages. And of course, we have life expectancy without limitation in daily activities, 65 years and older. But also in other domains, we have a contribution of different subjective indicators. For example, social relationship or governance, personal security. The subjective indicators are very, very important because we have in this domain, the domain of the security, there is the big gap between the objective situation and the perception of the people. It's really huge, the difference. I mean, later I can tell you a little bit about that if you are interested. And we have, you can see here that the domain number 8, subjective well-being, is a completely subjective domain. So all the indicators in this domain are subjective. And of course, we have the people life satisfaction. The people feeling their personal situation will improve in the next 5 years, and people satisfied of the leisure time. So this is the situation of the BES at the moment. And I want to conclude my presentation just speaking very quickly about what's the relationship between objective and subjective data. Of course, this is a huge topic. We can about this, and but just briefly, we can really try to summarize the situation, and we can draw a graph more or less like this, where we can see that the things are interlinked. So subjective well-being that is considered is a cognitive evaluation. So when you ask people, are you satisfied with your life? And you ask the people to rate between 0 and 10, the people make a overall evaluation of their own life. Of course, we don't know exactly the mental process of the people at that moment, but there is an agreement that the people make an overall assessment. So they consider altogether all the situations. So subjective well-being, that's why it's considered very important as an indicator. So subjective well-being is influenced by individual disposition. You can have, but also by, of course, contextual circumstances, objective indicators, but also by subjective aspects of social capital, for example, trust, or if they are scared to, or they feel not secure, for example. And then you have another domain that is self-realization that is very difficult to measure. But these things are also interlinked between them. So I published some papers about the relationship and subjective indicators, and you can see, of course, you see from the results that the subjective well-being is influenced a lot by objective conditions, for example, being unemployed, and this is what you can expect. But the how to say, the concomitance between objective and subjective situation can smooth or can increase the effect of objective situation. For example, if you are unemployed, but you are happy for your relationship situation, you're happy of the relationship with the family, with the friend, the effect on subjective well-being is much lower than if you are employed, but you are also isolated. So, and so it's not possible when you make an assessment to measure only the relationship between just couple of situations, but you have to measure the co-occurrence of situation to really have an assessment of the impact of some factors and identify the vulnerable people that can be in, let's say, very difficult situation. I will stop here. And
before we go on to Mauro, who's going to talk more about the work that we are doing on the specific project, it'd be quite nice to have some questions. What I've also talked through is some of the theoretical challenges, some of the sort of shifts across time that is used to calculate, and from that very deep knowledge of the Italian development, sort of technical for measuring. So if anybody has any questions at this stage for Adolfo, and then we'll move on to Mauro. Yeah, come on here, Adolfo, thank you. We'll have 10 or 15 minutes or so.
No mention of the direct line all the time.
and they have a huge impact on all the eudaimonic dimensions, like for example self-realization. We can imagine the impact of health or employment on your self-realization. Of course, your individual disposition can also have an impact. They can also have an impact on your individual disposition, and the contrary, your individual disposition can have an impact on the objective dimension. But the problem is that the individual disposition, and really here with individual disposition, I'm thinking about your personal traits. That is not your education level, because the education aspect like this are in the objective dimension. This is really your character, if you are outgoing or if you are more, close person. The problem is that it's really difficult to measure. So even if anecdotally I can say, yes, there is a relationship, for me it would be very difficult to say, yes, this relationship is strong in this way, I can measure in this way, because always my perspective is the one of the National Official Statistics. We don't have data on this. We don't even know how to measure individual disposition. We know that they are important from the literature, but if I would say, I have to say how to measure it, I wouldn't know.
Can I follow up a bit more about where people live or what's surrounding them? How that might be
where people live
in the general context of this kind of research.
Yeah, where people live actually is not on this slide, but where people live, I mean, we have some in the best. We have some information about the living environment. Is mainly subjective data, where we ask if the people think the area where they live is dangerous, or is, for example, noisy or polluted or things like this. And from my research, I mean, I didn't see an impact between these subjective aspects and subjective well-being. There is a little bit, I mean, there is not a clear agreement on this, I mean, even in the literature. While we can say that it's very straightforward, that a health condition or employment has a huge impact on subjective well-being, the evidence of the living environment on subjective well-being are a little bit confused. Sometimes they say that there is an impact. Other papers say that if you single out the effect of other factors, there is no impact at all. I think this may be because these are difficult aspects to measure. So you don't have very clear indicators, and each paper uses different indicators, and each country measure the things in a different way, and so you have different results, and you cannot have a consensus on this.
Interesting.
Could you just say a little bit more about how the indicators that have been used in VESS and within ISTAT as well, how they were actually identified and agreed upon, and whether or not there's a process of public consultation that goes on to identify what is deemed to be important to measure?
So, the BESS was born in 2013 officially with the first report, but the work, the design of the BESS started much before. And I mean, the main focus was to get a shared definition of well-being in Italy. So we excluded a top-down approach where ISTAT experts sit down on a table and decide that what's well-being in Italy. So we decided that another road that was much longer and much more difficult, to create a consultation table between ISTAT and the constitutional body that we have in Italy, that is the CNEL, where that is a body where its main mandate is to represent the civil society. So at this table we had the expert of ISTAT, we had politicians, we have labor union, we had different souls from the civil society, and we had a long discussion starting from the evidence of the other project, for example, the OECD, Eurostat, and the others, to say which are the dimensions that we have to consider in Italy when we talk about well-being. And we come up with the first list of the dimensions, and later we had a public consultation. We launched the public consultation on the ISTAT website. We sent letters to all the municipality, asked the university, asked the people to participate. And from where we ask, we are thinking about this dimension, what do you think? Do we miss something? Do we have to include something else? And after this, we had different inputs. And for example, after this consultation, we had another domains, that is the landscape and cultural heritage, that was not on the first list, because the people said, come on, we live in Italy. I mean, the landscape and the cultural heritage is so important. How can you skip this aspect? I was saying, Mark, that we also had some input that we didn't manage to measure. For example, people asked to measure the contribution of the Italian food to the well-being. We had to skip this because we don't have indicators. I mean, not from the health point of view of using olive oil or butter, but really, what's the contribution of having this cultural tradition of the food in Italy to the well-being? We are not up to this level. And finally, when there was an agreement on the domains, so at this moment we are only at the level of the domains, just this. In ISTAT, we created a huge scientific commission involving professors from university and also experts from other bodies. I mean, calling people for each domains, we call different experts, and we ask them, okay, we have these 12 domains. Considering the source of data available in Italy, which are the best indicators to measure the contribution of this domain to the well-being? So when we are talking about health, we are not talking about doing another repository of health indicators, because this makes no sense. There is the WHO. but we are asking the scientific commission to tell us which are the best indicators to measure the contribution of health to the well-being. And we come up with a list of 130 indicators. Best publish a report every year, but the most important success is just recently the Parliament agreed to use the best domains when we, in the, some of the best domains, in the, when we, I mean, in the document that talk about how to distribute, the annual document that talk about how to distribute the national resources. So when the Treasury Minister write this document, they also have to, using models, they also have to show which will be the impact of these policies on the some well-being indicators. For the moment, they adopt the six indicators of the best, but they are going to increase. And this is a huge challenge because it's not about the past. They have to show if we do this, if we implement this policy, which will be the impact in the next 3 years on these indicators. And there is very little literature on the impact, for example, on health or on, there is literature on some indicators, on other indicators there is much less literature on how to measure the impact on time.
Can I just follow up with another question?
Carry on.
Okay, just sorry, just I just wondered, one of the things that we're looking at in the report is the regionality aspect. I just wondered in the public consultation process whether you noticed a difference, firstly in the level of response, but also in the type of response that you got based on regions across Italy in terms of what people saw as key to their well-being. Was there a big difference in what people identified in the northern region versus the southern region and so on?
No, we didn't have this, no. But we have to say that the public consultation, even though we invited lots of people to participate, is of course biased. I mean, only research, high educated people responded to this consultation. So it's not, you cannot say that it's representative of the Italian society. So for this reason, we didn't have such a huge differences in the public consultation we are talking about. No, I can't say that, no.
One question at the back. Sir, and then Giovanni.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm Timor, I'm a professor of service and policy research. I find the topic really interesting. One of the problems there is with subjective measures is that they tend to result in moving standards. In healthcare, typically exemplified by the fact that when people have to rate hypothetical status, they typically rate it worse than when actually they acquire that status. So being bedbound is certainly, when it's your only way of being alive, it becomes much better health, consistently better, higher increased well-being in relative terms. So this is probably less of an issue with health care related or health related well-being. The fact that the reference framework is expanded. I mean, we used to, as societies, tend to use reference frameworks which were closer, and they are increasingly more global. And I was interested in knowing whether this was being researched from the general well-being perspective as part of the efforts that you were describing by the OECD or by other relevant bodies.
I'm not sure I understood your question. I mean, I understood this regarding the health services.
And I was just perhaps exemplifying how the standard of the framework reference has an impact on how people rate their own well-being.
Okay.
And the fact that the reference framework is changing in societies as they are less close and increasingly being more part of a global conversation. So that it's no longer your reference to people in your own town or your working environment, and maybe people around the whole globe, and whether this is being systematically studied by any of the initiatives that you were describing. I
understand. in some parts, in the sense that, I mean, the initiatives like BES and the OECD House Life, they are mainly focused on measuring well-being. So they don't deal with all the discussion about measuring indicators. Usually they refer to the literature, so they try to see, okay, on subjective well-being, which are the indicators on which there is an agreement, and then they say, okay, life satisfaction, there is an agreement, so let's use life satisfaction. So not on this context. But I know that in other contexts, I mean, there are lots of discussion on some indicators, not on all the indicators. For example, on life satisfaction, there was a lot of research on how the cultural differences can influence the answer of life satisfaction. At the global level, for example, we know that the people from certain countries in Asia, they tend to give a score that is much lower than people from Latin America, even though the objective condition in this Asian country, for example, the Japanese, I mean, even though the objective condition in Japan are much better than the condition in Latin America. So there is an agreement, but not really a proof that some cultural traits can influence the way you reply to some of these questions. And this is something really a hard structure that of your culture that is quite impossible to break, you know. Even you rephrase the question in a different way, methodologically it's really difficult to single out this aspect. To be more specific to your question, I really don't know if there are specific studies that try to see if being part of a global society really influence these subjective indicators. As far as I know, I think the answer at the moment is no, in the sense that we still observe these differences. So we still know that the Japanese will answer with scores that are much lower than the people of, for example, Honduras, that live in conditions that are much poorer, much less developed. So I really don't know. I don't have the state-of-the-art situation. I don't know if there is some specific research on this. But for sure, there was lots of work also on even how you translate the concept. When you ask, are you satisfied with your life? This word satisfied can be really tricky to translate in some culture, because in some culture can mean something that is completely different to other cultures. So when you translate, if you are interested in this, I suggest you to read this, that is the OECD guidelines for measuring subjective well-being. That is a book that is available on the website of the OECD that address all these questions. So there is really.
Do you want to have one more question?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm an outsider. I come from philosophy of science, philosophy of science and emotion. So, but I'm really fascinated by this, but also stress incredibly difficult. This whole measurement of subjective well-being, and in the philosophy of psychology, there's lots of skepticism about subjective reports, whether they're reliable or not, blah blah. So I wonder how much you worry about that. And I was thinking about this general, these questions that ask generally about rating how satisfied you are of your life. I mean, I was thinking myself, you asked me today, I might say 8, but yesterday when it was rainy, I'm Italian by the way, so I said, what am I doing? The sun rain of 40 there. So I mean, it's not very, I quite shift my sense of life satisfaction. It shifts quite dramatically, I find. I'm not myself sure what my life satisfaction is. So how much do you worry about this?
No, I mean, we are very worried, but as I said before, I mean, when you address such a huge problem, you have to trust the work done by the others, and you have to either put your feet on the shoulders of the literature. So there was lots of research on the life satisfaction. You have to consider that in the domains of official statistics, the official statistic was, I mean, until 15 years ago, was objective centered and was economically centered. So first was considered already a taboo to speak about social aspect in the official statistic domain. Then little by little we managed to introduce, to say, look, social aspects are important. And later on it was considered like a really, a blasphemy to talk about subjective indicators. So these were the indicators like life satisfaction were really put under a huge scrutiny to be accepted by the community of official statisticians, because of course there are huge concerns. What can we say? We can say that, of course, there are huge differences due to the culture. There are difficulties due to the translation of the terms. There are difficulties due to the way the people evaluate, they make this assessment when you ask them, are you satisfied with your life? There are even concerns about the tiny methodological aspects on how you ask this question. For example, the Gallup survey, it's a private company that does a lot on this subject. Visually in the questionnaire, use a ladder. So it says, this is a ladder, this 0 is the bottom level, 10 is the upper level, on which level you will put yourself. For example, in Europe, we decided not to use the ladder because we don't want to associate the idea of being better to the idea that you have to, you make a physical effort to go up, because a ladder you have to climb. So it seems almost, something that makes you tired to reach. So there is lots of discussion about this, but and at the end, some concern remains, but we can say that life satisfaction and other subjective indicators are fully scrutinized, and that they really work when you see the relationship between these indicators and objective situations. Of course, they work related to what? They work when you see them at the macro level. So I want to compare the north region of Italy with the south region of Italy. They don't work if I speak about myself or yourself, because we have differences. Today we are happy because there is the sun, or because the Italy football team won, which is difficult, but and tomorrow can be different, But at macro level they work, and they work to do what? They work where if you want to measure that part of the full picture that is not possible to measure only with the objective indicators. So my last message is when you talk about well-being, you have to, there is no shortcut to the complexity. You have to face the complexity. Any proposal, composite indicators or headline indicators can work when you want to give a message for communication purpose. But if you are a researcher, you have to try to see the full picture. And this means that you have to mix up with the complexity. You have to face the complexity. There is no other way.
Can I just ask one question? In the broad context, do you see that this will change the way, the overall conversation in government, for example? So I'm just kind of thinking at the moment, I was watching something in the House of Parliament today, some question time, and some of the MPs, for example, are raising things from their constituents, describing their real life situation. I have somebody come to me, this is their life situation, this is their problem. And there seems to be this massive disconnect because the person stands up and the answer that they give is the traditional statistical, or we put so much money into it. It feels, if you're on the receiving end of that, if you're one of those people, that your subjective experience of life has been completely dismissed and discounted because the person in government replying just gives you an economic, how much money they've put in, how much blah, 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 and they
the general conversation doesn't reflect any of this sense that parts of what they're concerned with is all this stuff that you...
I mean, apart the fact that being an official statistician means that you have a very frustrating life. I mean, because of course nobody cares about what you are doing. I mean, this is pretty, there is a general agreement about that. But we can say that bit by bit, I mean, in our experience, if you insist and there is a consistency in what you do, you can get results. I mean, you know, now in Italy, we are very proud of these results. I mean, we managed, of course, at the beginning, when we released the first best report, there was, I mean, an official presentation of the report with the President of the Republic, the Prime Minister, and immediately after that, nothing. Yeah, exactly what you say. I mean, the politician keep going in the, but bit by bit, we managed to raise a discussion in the Parliament, and now we managed to put, I mean, we have this law, so it's a law of the Italian government, saying that when you make the budget for the next 3 years, you have to say which will be the impact of the budget and the fact that you will invest more in the, for example, in health and less in the education on a certain numbers of the best indicators. While before this was only, this report was focusing only on the impact on GDP. So this for us is a huge attainment, to have a law that says now when you make the budget, the official Italian budget for the next 3 years, you have to say not only which will be the impact on the GDP, but will be the impact on CO2, on the life expectancy, on employment rate, on income level and income distribution, and some other indicators. And at the moment, they are focusing on 6, but the idea is to increase the number. So this is a result. But I mean, you have to insist. I mean, change of paradigm does come easy.
Adolfo, thank you very much. That's a beautiful note. Change of paradigm doesn't come easy. That is absolutely right, I think. And there is work to be done, I think. And before we move on to Maro, I want to introduce it with some follow-ups, I think, because I think what you've raised is some really fantastic questions. In terms of the incorporation of patient experience, for example, or public voices, I think one of the key aims of the Wellcome Centre is to look at ways in which new forms of evidence, different forms of evidence, can be incorporated into political discourse and policy. That is not easy, as Adolfo has said, but it's one of our aspirations here, that we do challenge what constitutes evidence in these ways. The second point I wanted to make, and it comes back to Giovanna's point, is that I don't think we can see measures of subjective well-being as an end point, but as a starting point. If we take the Italian and UK situation, Italy has, rates itself 6.7 nationally or something in well-being, life satisfaction. UK is 7.1. Now, if you take that as an indication of how we really feel, you're making a mistake. If you take that as a starting point for saying why, what is it that shapes the way Italians report as opposed to people in the UK, then you can begin to open up a discussion about what matters to people and what kind of cultural context are shaping those. So I don't think we should, I think everybody working in this field recognizes that well-being and measuring subjective well-being is deeply problematic, but it's an interesting starting point to raise more questions and look at new ways of doing things. In order to introduce Mara, I just want to raise something else from Adolfo's talk, and that is this, that when countries, member states are going to report on well-being, there are 4 objective well-being domains: social relations, environment, education, and employment income. One subjective indicator, life satisfaction. So in some ways, it's brutal, it's clear, but it's quite constricted. The difficulty is if countries are going to have to report in those 5 areas, and within the country, there is this kind of granularity to the evidence, the data, the work. I mean, this is specific, I think, to what Adolfo has been doing. I think in Italy, they have been very ambitious in trying to set out the complexity. But if you're trying to write a wellbeing report that responds to what the WHO are asking a country to report on, at the same time as taking cultural specificity and this kind of granularity into that account, it's actually very, very difficult to do. And that is, of course, what we've tasked Mauro with doing in writing this, is to take the WHO indicators so that a member state can report, but at the same time get that richness of cultural detail and depth that allows a country to report in some kind of way that is measurable but also traceable, even though the context is fluid and always changing. So, Mauro, tell us how it's done.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Hello again. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Measuring Wellbeing in Italy, a Cultural Perspective. And this presentation drew from a report that Mark mentioned just a minute ago on building up a wellbeing profile of Italy. And in particular with Mark and Felicity, that you met earlier. We are looking at building up a profile using the WHO indicators of objective and subjective well-being, and which just Mark mentioned a minute earlier, and the instant indicators of equitable and sustainable well-being. And we are talking at the domains that Adolfo mentioned. There were 12 domains. And this is a proof of concept report, and primarily we had two objectives, which is to assist the WHO member states to develop a country-level profiles of well-being, which means basically literally to help these states to help them to show how to present on paper a format on how to present indicators and form of well-being. And the second, which is also where I will focus in my presentation today, is looking at integrating. So I like to use my hands quite a lot when I talk. So the idea of integrating data, okay, so they come together. Sometimes they clash, but sometimes they find a way to come together. So we are looking at integrating quantitative and qualitative data, employing a cultural perspective to inform measurements of well-being. So, a question, what does quantitative data mean in the context of well-being? Well, in a short answer, it means number, statistic, trends. And for example, the WHO indicator to measure subjective well-being is their indicator gives indication on life satisfaction. So I repeat, life satisfaction is translated into a number. And instant indicator measure this in a slightly different way, looking at subjective well-being in Italy. So it's got 5 indicators which are part of this domain: life satisfaction, free time satisfaction, positive and negative outlook for the future. And here we got an example, okay, how these graphically are represented. So if we look at the bottom, we got a line that looks at the trend of soddisfazione per la propria vita, means life satisfaction, and the giudizio positivo sulle prospettive future means positive outlook for the future. So we can see clearly here that we go a score 0 to 70, and here a range of ages. So easily we can see a pattern in this. So this is how quantitative numbers are translated visually. But then, when we're looking at qualitative data, what does qualitative data mean in the context of well-being? Any ideas? Would you like to help me on this? I like interactive presentations. They get less tedious sometimes. But we can look at a definition of culture that can help us to draw this what quantitative data means. But broadly speaking, we can say that this provides an example of, broadly speaking, They allow us to introduce an element of subjectivity, so subjective experiences. We're talking about experience of how people feel, but also they offer the opportunity to create interdisciplinary work. So we got different experts coming together. For instance, Mark in this work brings expertise on medicine history, Felicity brings expertise on geography and development, and I bring some expertise on social sciences looking at culture. But going back to the definition of a culture, WHO used this specific definition of culture. So it's a set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or a social group. It encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So, going back to a recap, we are looking, well, in this report, I'm looking how to integrate quantitative and qualitative data. So we got, in terms of quantitative data, we got the statistics from ISTAT and WHO indicators. And in terms of qualitative data, we are drawing from a broad range of qualitative data. So we are looking at films, literature, history, subjective narratives. And how do we make this together? How do I make sense of all of this? Basically, I'm looking at a concept of mechanism. So if we're looking at numbers, okay, and I want to make sense of numbers, and we got also these qualitative data films, what is something, the mechanism is underneath that brings this together? So I'm looking at mechanism. So this is a definition I've taken from a sociological definition they use a lot in realist evaluation, and is underlying structure in a specific cultural context. So it's very specific. So in the case of Italy, now we got in the case studies of Italy, what does that mean? Okay, so we got a map of Italy. So we have to bear in mind cultural differences and also regional differences. In the best report, for instance, when they provide a commentary, they make a definition, historical definition between north and south of Italy. Okay, so more or less, we got the north of Italy, center and south. Okay, and so these come quite alike, these regional differences, but also we're looking at communities. For instance, historically, we had with when there was the economic, we call it in Italy economic boom. It means literally the economic development of Italy in the 50s. There was a lot of internal movement moving to the region of Piemonte, Lombardia, and Liguria. And they call it a triangle because people moved primarily in the city of Milan, Turin, and Genoa. This is one of the examples. So, now we move to the case, one of the first of the case studies. Any idea? Well, we got here a source is from called Loose Cannons, is a film. Any idea what the first case study may be about? Don't look at Mark or Felicity. Any ideas? Well, the first case study looks at the family. So this is a picture that are still a picture taken from a film, and we got a family, a traditional family gathering together with a meal. We were talking earlier about subjectivity and looking at nutrition and food. So again, the structure, we're looking at layers. So again, we are combining the WHO indicators and looking at the ISTAT domains and indicators. And in particular, for ISTAT, we're looking at the domain of social relationships. So we're looking at family, friends, network, people. And the cultural mechanism in this cultural approach, we're looking at the family as that kind of cultural element that can bring this data together. And why family? Family, in Italy, family life is regarded to be regulated by the macrostructure of the state and the Roman Catholic Church, whose social and cultural presence shape the well-being of most Italians. What does that mean? That the church and the state provide that kind of framework that's got an impact on the family and the well-being consequently. And this is written on paper. For instance, on the Article 29 of the Italian Constitution, we read, "The Republic recognizes the rights of the family as a natural society founded on marriage." And this opened up a discussion on definition of marriage in modern Italy and notion of family. And this has got an impact on well-being of people, how they feel about themselves, about the family, about the broader society. So the second case studies look at quantitative data of environment and well-being. When I'm looking at environment and well-being, you might remember the slides where Adolfo presented numbers with the different domains. So we draw from that. We got the WHO indicator again. They're looking at the percentage of population with improved sanitation facilities, and it's the domain of the environment, so quality of air in the city, wastewater treatment, and availability of green areas. And the mechanism that kind of bring this together is the element of heritage, Italian heritage. In this specific case, we look at qualitative data using an historical perspective, historical sources, so looking at texts around that, and also oral history. Oral history, I can't remember the name of the lady that, sorry, what was your name? Sorry, I forgot. Yes?
Janet.
Janet was asking earlier, there is this kind of narrative or rhetoric of the state, for instance, say, oh, we're investing money in the people, but what actually does mean this to people? Well, for instance, in the case of Italy, historical activities of monastery represent an example of heritage. Their legacy to look after the landscape have a repercussion for well-being and for real communities around this. Here is an example of regionality. We have an abbey, there is an abbey in Praglia, which is in Veneto region, which is in the northeast. And all around it, historically, it had a lot of land. And the historical activity on land reclamation around the entire region had huge impact for subjective, the life of people, and also the communities. And still the legacy is apparent today with activities of biofarming, traditional beekeeping, for instance, for impollination, and as I said, land reclamation in the past. And finally, our last case study, looking at subjective well-being. And as I said earlier, when I showed the tables, we were looking at patterns. So we got life satisfaction and the other indicator that we discussed earlier. And here, as a final remark, I look at a mechanism that comes from a sentence taken from a Latin satire. There's the saying of mens sana in corpore sano, which translates a healthy mind in a healthy body. So this works for the purpose of this case study is a cultural domain which underpins a synergy between the well-being of the mind and of the body. We draw looking at proverbs, saying, sport, music, TV, and fashion. And here we got an example taken from a photographic book on fashion, where the cultural context of fashion is not just give an indication of positive outlook on health and the body, but also a negative implication for well-being. We think all about the debate that there was on size zero. And this morning, when I was traveling on the train to Exeter, I was looking at the paper, and an article says, operas will let the fat lady sing. So we can see, for instance, that this is not something that look at sizes with clothing, but also in the broader, some people will call it a literalist, world of art. So, in conclusion, the case studies of the family, heritage, and a healthy mind in a healthy body in the case of Italy provide an example of how a cultural approach with the idea of a mechanism can integrate quantitative and qualitative, so they can come together to inform comprehensive understandings of well-being. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mauro. You can see from the general remarks, the setting of the scene, the questions by Adolfo, the challenge, and you can see now perhaps another kind of challenge, and that is how can you convince through those narratives, through those cultural approaches, through those qualitative sources, how can you help to generate a narrative of well-being that means something, that perhaps offers some kind of way of tracking across time the impact of political decisions, for example, or policies. But the incredible challenge, I mean, I think what Mauro is beginning to do is excavate some case studies. The question still remains about whether the insights from those case studies can be incorporated into a political or policy forming discussion in meaningful ways. So there's lots of questions, I think, more questions we're unearthing than we are answering here. But questions for Mauro or Mauro and Adolfo. Do you want to both come up maybe and double up? I will.
Double up.
Double up. Laurel and Hardy. Wolf of Wise. So any questions for Mauro and Adolfo, because in a sense their papers are also neatly complementary.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing what was shared and the complexity. I'm trying to make a link in my own mind between practicality, say, policy development, and what you might be doing, and that people respond emotionally to what is given to them or directed. But backing policy and research you've been doing, connecting this together, do you capture emotions which are in the system in any way? That's too broad, too simple a question.
In which system are you thinking?
So I'm thinking that a lot of when we talk research and academic wise, it's quite nice that you can step back and collect the information, be quite detached, and produce a report. But then when you're reading it, so another person reading it might have an emotional journey of what they see and what they feel. Another filter of perception comes up, and whether that is at all, could that be captured at the earlier stage when we're trying to understand the cultural aspects of why people like to belong in a certain region, why people are attached to a certain way of doing. I'm trying to explore the human side of what you're sharing. And then, you mean no answer, I'm just sharing.
Sorry. I think that is quite interesting for me that there's been, let's call it a cultural and social political shift from health to well-being. So when we talk about health, we're still talking about health, of course, but it's one component of well-being. So when we're talking about well-being, it allows us to have a broader picture. And looking at subjectivity in the way that you were kind of nuancing, an idea that is not new, but we incorporate, is talking about subjective experiences. For instance, I might recall that you're working as a PPI, so in public engagement, and you might participated in a lot of studies of different nature, but your contribution as other your fellows were essential because you provide lived experiences. So what we call subjective, technically subjective narratives. Those at early stage of research are really crucial because they give the flavor, and also they shape, how we draw the research. So they are very much part of the process of the research. There is a but at the end that sometimes when we report on this research, because we have to meet some criteria and there is a format, is there, but it doesn't sometimes flare up as it should be, but it's still there. But this opportunity that also WHO is giving, for instance, framing well-being in a context that is from the UNESCO, which is cultural, that incorporates well-being looking at a system of beliefs. Felicity is also looking at intangible culture, for instance. So with example of, heritage and looking at also what is really, we can't really see in a culture of habits. That is something that's quite exciting, and that can incorporate in new evidence and new forms of evidence. So there's this kind of bubbling of research that is coming up. I'm not sure if Felicity might want to say more about it.
I guess just to add, and I don't think this directly answers the question, but just to add by saying that by bringing in things like literature and arts and films, which are all very emotional, you're able to kind of pick on things that have resonated with people within that culture. So you're able to sort of draw some of that experience out that way as well. And I think that's really quite a unique perspective that we're able to bring into support. As Mara says, the problem is then condensing that down into something that's readable in a 30-page report, which is essentially what we've been asked to do.
Yeah.
So it is difficult.
So I maybe reframe it a little bit, because you had one slide about positive and negative feedback or effects. That has to measurable statements from people, both positive and negative. And that's I'm talking about the human language here.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example, for instance, of human language that, that's why I was smiling when Felicity was talking. We were reviewing this report with Mark and Felicity, and we were talking. And Felicity made this remark, but does actually life satisfaction, which is, the definition that WHO gives, does that actually mean happiness? Because when writing the report, I was typing about happiness. So again, yeah, it's about satisfaction, but sometimes it's interesting also between researchers and the wider public, also the difference in meaning. What comes up as happiness is satisfaction. And also, for instance, I didn't put in this slide because otherwise it would be too much. Felicity was talking about different aspects, for instance, proverbs. We have an Italian saying about the idea of doing bella figura, so to impress people. That is an element of our culture, in the Italian culture, that is intangible. You can't really touch it. There is no textbook on that. But go to Italy on a Saturday afternoon in a piazza and see people walking up and down the piazza to impress other people with a bella figura. And for instance, this has got implication in the fashion system, So this is a kind of tangible, maybe stereotypical examples of Italy, but that, shape the nation for the better and for the worse. For instance, we were looking at images of, men without ties, that, we're looking at images of athletic bodies, which is fortunate, but there is also the dark side of fashion that, they are kind of constrained in terms of body shapes, in terms of clothing sizing. That is not an aspect that is still a cultural aspect, but that might have negative implication for people. So you write there, sometimes when we write down, it's very difficult to encompass in a sentence all these kind of cultural or subjective nuances.
If I can add something, I mean, from a completely different perspective, when we write our reports on well-being, we try to think about the sentiments of the population, and we try to also to disaggregate the information in order to give information on topics that are pretty sensitive, exactly because we know that some topics are stereotypes, but these stereotypes can move they can fuel huge feelings in the population. So, for example, when you talk about a very hard indicators about homicide, I mean, Italy from this point of view is one of the most secure places on earth. I mean, the homicide rate has been falling for years and now is one of the lowest in the world. So nothing to say about that. But when you disaggregate homicide, we can see that this rate has been falling because there is a huge reduction in the rate of men being killed, while the women being killed has barely changed in the last 15 years. Of course, the number and the proportion of women being killed is much lower even now compared to the proportion of men being killed. But when you look at the trends, the man being killed is going down, the female being killed is stable. So this is why, because men being killed was killed because of crime, either thief or the organized crime and things like that, while the women are killed by the partners or the close member of the family. This means that all the policies that have been done in 15 years, 20 years to reduce the homicide rate have been no effect on the homicide rate of the women. And this is something that can raise huge discussion at the policy level, because we are essentially saying that the politicians are not able to face this problem, but also in the society, because the people don't like to be said that they like this idea that all the crime in Italy are carried out by the foreigners, by the strangers. They don't like to be said that it's the family to kill the females. And that if you are a woman in Italy, you have a higher chance to be killed by your father or by your partners than to be killed by foreigners coming from another country. So, and as an official statistician, what will you do? Of course, this is not something that will make you popular. But what will you do? You have to face this. And of course, you can disaggregate the data in thousands of ways. So when you disaggregate the data, you have to think about which are the most outstanding problems of your country, and you have to put the limelight on this, even though they are not really popular. No? It's really challenging, because you do lots of work and then enough a comment or a politician that says, but the foreigners are always the one to make the most of the mess in Italy, and then your work disappear completely.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, that's really helpful in lots of ways, and it raises a lot of challenges. The question about emotions capturing, I mean, there are two issues, I think. One is how do you capture them, in a sense, through the methods that we use in the humanities and social sciences. How do we then often lose them in the process of writing the reports or the academic papers, because there are certain restrictions and constraints on how you do that? And then how do you use that to lever different policy responses? One of the things about those narratives, the emotional dimension, the affective dimension, is perhaps the most powerful, but it's also the most likely component of your research to get distanced and marginalized as it's reduced to an academic argument, a set of figures, a set of tables. And yet it could be that those stories, those emotional responses, are our most powerful advocate for this type of work playing into policy. The question is the ways in which they get reduced to numbers, or the way they get pushed out by the sort of numerical and so forth.
I think for that, the importance of that, because another side to it is that when you produce your work, you call the seeing injustices. And that the information you gave, so what about me, what about that?
Yeah.
So it generates emotion from another perspective as
Yes.
well. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I think, part of the fact that you come from that sort of PPI area and knowledge of that is important to us, because a lot of our Wellcome Centre work focuses on co-production, co-creation of knowledge, of research questions, of outputs, so that it doesn't become an expert academic voice entirely, but a co-produced narrative. Now that's in some ways desirable and achievable perhaps through certain research methods, but there's still a risk that that can become anecdotal, put aside as exceptional in some kind of way, in a not appropriate, it can be silenced. There are ways of marginalizing and silencing voices even as you incorporate them. And the political challenge is how to keep those voices alive through the process in a way that, in ways that are not able to be pushed out by men in suits, I was going to say. I feel a bit careful because I see a doctor looking very nice. But you know what I'm saying? There's a sense of a power structure that mitigates against the genuine cooperation of multiple voices. That's what I'm saying.
There is, but also you have a role as academics to forewarn policymakers of the errors of certain routes they can take if they don't listen to research. And it's that kind of waste of public money or acts in the population.
And that's why, in a sense, this kind of work that Adolfo's doing, that Mara is doing here, we are hoping to provide the evidence that shows the dangers of not taking cultural contexts seriously. That's, in a sense, dangerous is perhaps too strong a word, but you know what I mean, the risks, the problems with not taking the cultural and social context seriously enough. Particularly when you're reporting in this kind of area, where culture, society becomes absolutely crucial to understanding the statistics as well.
Now, of course, Mark, a topical case in mind is something like Brentwood Tower, where you've got this very direct conflict between, if you like, objective financial calculations, the pressures of austerity acting on the local authority and so forth, versus the sentiments and emotions and things within that community. And that clash will be laid out very publicly in the next few months over the course of the inquiry. So I think there are lessons there from a live example which may contribute to this.
Just ask a question. I'm also curious about the way that you then collect the data. I assume you have questionnaires, and I wonder are these questionnaires usually filled in online, or do you have telephone conversations with people, or do you also have collect statistics through face-to-face questions and interviews and so on? I'm asking because from time to time I work in mental health research, clinical trials, and obviously you do you have a lot of data systems for a number of different conditions, trying to find out how somebody's well-being is, in fact. But what is interesting about that is some of these are going to be filled in by in our case, patients themselves, and others are actually done through interviews, for example, and yet others again, more often, are through the net, through various data collecting websites. So I'm curious where how that works, how you collect the data.
Yeah, for this specific presentation that rose from the report that I'm working with Mark and Felicity, we're looking at secondary data, which means that in the case we're using, Adolfo was talking about the indicators, so is a work that is already there, that's been published, and everyone can go online and download that. So we look at something that's already written for this specific one, and also for when I was looking, for instance, about other case studies, where the instance of fashion of the monastery, that is again secondary data that is widely available. The aim of this presentation for me was more about the process, to kind of give a sense, a flavor, and to captivate in a way, make you interested to see how we can work together to combine them. But you are absolutely right. I mean, the data collection, I've been involved in different projects before these ones. Some of them are on patient safety, some of them are directly with mental health. And it's important that we have to say, we take it for granted that all these projects before, they have to go through ethical approval. So we have to make absolutely sure that that before they get into place, there is ethical approval that is within the university, and sometimes with the NHS. And sometimes, for instance, for my PhD on a different topic, I was looking at HIV in Italy. We had kind of ethical approval from the European Commission, from local, and sometimes it takes as long as 6 months. So in that respect, we want to reassure the public, the wider public, that when data are collected, we are really aware, we take that extremely seriously. So, that is, at the extent that, everything's password protected. So we follow that. In terms of looking specifically at a cultural approach where I was looking today, I was using more the idea of the mechanism that idea is taken for a system of evaluating complex NHS intervention. At the moment they're using it quite a lot, but they're doing from sociology. So I use one component of that to show that in a way cultural studies that draws from the humanity, from social science, from geography, also from statistics, sometimes there is an element of that, can help to inform. We are not, there is no an argument say that cultural studies can provide all the answer, absolutely not. But together, looking at numbers, we can give a wider picture. And sometimes we had this conversation earlier, it becomes more complex. But complex and complicated is not necessarily bad, because you open up new questions and so other stuff. Because I mean, I yes or no in a statistics sometimes don't really kind of captures. Or for instance, in your studies, sometimes if you're looking, you have to tick a box in order to be able to participate in these studies. You have to be in an age range. You have to to be engaged if it is mental health. In physical activities, what is your weight? Are you prepared to, wear a watch to monitor things? So they are all elements that are within a scale and a format. So it really depends on the focus that we are, where we are. But for this specific, the data is already available. There is a kind of a secondary reading of what is happening.
Yeah, I was just curious because
of course.
Also following up from Alice's good question, because of course these rater systems in mental health, they are extremely about emotions, mostly,
Yeah.
and to kind of gauge that, and what I noticed first of all, to my astonishment, is that many of these systems are actually international, and so the culture of a place where it is applied is not taken into consideration at all, which is totally surprising to me, because being also abroad, I have a different, I suppose, perspective a little bit as well. And then the second thing is that these different methods of actually collecting the data seems to make an enormous difference, because also it very much depends on the person who is, say, doing the interview, and that person, if they have a lot of experience, then they can kind of rate. But each question they have to rate and ticks boxes, and so there is already sort of a in between again, and so I'm just sort of trying to figure out how this can kind of come together.
One last thing, if I may, for instance, part of the work that Mark and Felice, the other people at the centre, they are taking an approach now that's looking at the life course. And one of the words that recur, if you look on the website, is transformation. This transformative approach that hopefully, I'm sure it will, kind of, we'll look at this into more details. So, I mean, we are in a way moving forward from that kind of data collection. So,
but it's also, I mean, at least for official statistics, there is also a huge body of research on a methodological approach. So not only lots of research on how to collect the data using questioning and the techniques to approach the people to get the answer, but also lots of research on how to translate the things in a way that this will affect comparability. And thanks to Eurostat, mainly in Europe, and partially to the OECD in a larger arena, we have done lots of work to harmonize the data in order to get the comparability. It's for this reason that we use some indicators and we don't use other indicators. So on the subjective well-being, we use at the European level, we use life satisfaction, but we don't use the affects, because there is no agreement on how to collect comparable data on if you feel if your life is fulfilling or if you were hungry yesterday or happy yesterday. So there is a reason why some indicators are widely available at international level and other indicators are not available. And the reason is mainly methodological, because there is a consensus on that some things can be collected and compared and other things not at this stage. But this is a general problem of all the science. I mean, even if you look at physics, astronomy, I mean, the way of collecting data have changed, and when the method improve, you can get other insight and you can solve problems that before you could not solve. This is a general problem.
But just to add to that, one of the reasons that we're using secondary data is because countries that have to report on health and wellbeing, it's a massive task to have to do these reports. And WHO has been very concerned not to add significantly to the burden of reporting that already exists. So the idea of collecting primary data could be very, very complicated and a sort of never-ending task, I think. And many of the countries that we're dealing with, we don't have the resources to be able to do that without it becoming a huge burden to them. So I think it's just worth clarifying, and that's another reason why we're taking the approach that we are.
And the time constraints.
In the time constraints.
Yes. Are there other questions? Yeah, do.
Characters at a high level, WHO and country states. Might be anything about this, but is this helping WHO and member states be more convergent in their policies, or with this great divergence?
It's an interesting question. It's a tension that in some ways we are working through as well. One of the aspirations, if you like, of WHO, if you look at their reports, is a common policy framework, something that is applicable across the region and that can give meaningful comparisons across time and space, as Christy was saying at the beginning. But at the same time, they want to recognise cultural specificity and the fact that nations and regions, member states, will have their own specific narratives and trajectories. How you marry and integrate the desire for a common policy framework at the same time as taking account of cultural specificity is really a major challenge, I think. And what has happened, I think, a lot in the past, and this is where the cultural context of health approach begins to change it, is that there's been a predominance in terms of reporting on morbidity and mortality, which I'm not saying it's easy necessarily to measure illness, but I think it's easier than what we're trying to do here in some ways. And you can have a sort of common policy framework at one level for that, not entirely, but the moment you get into these kinds of areas, then cultural specificity becomes absolutely key. And you can see any attempt to coalesce is going to be frustrated by cultural specificity. And it's that tension, I think, that we're playing with. We're sort of testing this. Can we develop a model or a template that will be available, that people can use, at the same time as allowing them to incorporate into that an element of their particular identity and cultural context? It's a really big challenge.
And one of that is disrupt the whole process. So if we give a jump in climate change, we get migration,
Yes.
How that would impact, or are there what if scenarios built in later downstream ideas? I don't
Just clarify.
Christy is
It's a huge question.
not saying I'm a migration expert, but
I'm just interested in all the work you're doing and really get it and a big disruptive event. And then
Yes.
what you've done has to be readjusted, and the biggest disruptive event will be mass migration, whether it's a war, whether it's climate change, and whether you take that as a what if you were developing it further, whether that's in the pipeline downstream, that's really
I think, Italy, well, if we don't take the case of Italy, Italy has been the front line of the migration crisis in recent years. So it's absolutely a key aspect that impacts well-being in Italy at the moment. And it may well be that we think about developing that as a case study. So yes, the report is able to deal with that, the broader situation at that time, and then of course if the next report comes out, it might be that that situation has changed a bit. So there's space within that to be able to recognise those changes and to kind of gauge what's going on in terms of public mood, which we could do through thinking up through literature or through film or that kind of published narratives. So there is space for that in theory. Yeah.
I'm asking you.
For instance, in the report, we're looking very marginally on that, but when we are talking about family and social relationship, we are looking, there is a note that look, for instance, at the literature of interfaith families. So there is that, and that looking at the literature of interfaith families, there is an element of people migrating from North Africa, moving to Italy, and getting married, living in Italy and getting married. So that's why they're called interfaith, because it's the case of a Catholic getting married with a Muslim. So that it takes a bit to sediment to become part of the culture, but it's getting there. It's not specifically about the bigger picture of migration, but it's a small contribution. And as Mark said at the beginning of the slide, also this is a proof of concept report. So hopefully with a cultural approach, we are able to give all these nuances.
I think what's more challenging, particularly in the case of migration, is how you actually capture the experiences of the migrants. You know, we're a very large population in some European countries, so it's how you actually incorporate those voices that are quite often silenced or peripheral, because very often they don't appear in published literature or in surveys or anything. So, you know, it's something we're aware of, we're thinking about.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
Felicity was talking, was it over the summer that you were in Sicily talking about these issues around migration and as part of, was it a seminar conference? So,
A summer school.
A summer school. So there is, especially in the case study of Italy, there is a sense of the sense of movement. Historically, there is a history of Italy of, that's why I was talking about communities. When we're looking at the variables, there is a sense of region that is used also in the ISTAT report, that is well known, but also of internal movement. I gave the example that you find in all history books. When you go to school, it's part of the curriculum, you read about these economic explosions. So people from the south, also from my region in Veneto, which is northeast, they move to the city of Milan. So, and that's where we were talking earlier about the idea of, you know, culture and communities coming together. For instance, a little curiosity in my area, people are really fond of a food that is called polenta. There's this mixture, but that is something that is really completely alien in the part of Milan. So that part of where I live integrated that dish in the area of Milan. This is just a tiny example to give you an example of intangible culture, because that is not really, you know, in any books, but I was lucky to know that, A, because I'm really fond of polenta, and B, because that was said, it was an example of history, oral history, that my grandmother that, you know, lived through the war and told me. So these are example nuances that they are not in the report as such, but that's where we get this kind of information from.
Can I ask a Adolfo a question? I was intrigued by that slide you showed with the sort of historical development, and just ask you to reflect perhaps on the past and also on the future. You've worked in this area for a long time, contributed massively to developing both the methodological questions but also some substantive data. What do you make of what's changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years and the way it's moved from GDP economics into the more personal subjective? And where do you think we're at? What do we need to do to establish this kind of debate as part of a policy approach or a paradigm of understanding health and well-being? So it's partly, you know, how do you explain, what do you make of the shift from GDP into something different, and where do you feel at the moment this might go, and perhaps to some extent then what we might contribute to where we're going. If you said the extra WHO Collaborating Centre should do something, what would it be?
Difficult question. Difficult question because we are fighting a difficult, let's say, enemy, if I can say. I mean, GDP. I mean, Kuznets, if you read Kuznets, he was really, I mean, it was really a genius not only for creating the GDP, but also to identify the risk of the GDP. So what Kuznets said were two main things. I mean, he spoke to the Congress because he invented the GDP immediately after he was scared by the GDP. So he said to the Congress two things. First, if you think to measure the society, the overall progress of the society using GDP, you are wrong. Because GDP only measures the production, so mainly an output measure. And the second thing said, be aware of the GDP, because GDP is an easy measure. Of course, GDP is not easily constructed, there is lots of methodology. But when you come out with the number that we all know, that is not even GDP, but is the increase rate of GDP, that one is an easy measure, so the people will get fascinated by this easy measure. Also, since and so it will become the only measure that the people will use. So, and we are still fighting this. I mean, we are still fighting the fact that everyone says, okay, my GDP is this, and what's your GDP? My GDP is bigger than yours. There is also a study that says that since the politicians are mainly men, there is also a pre-appeasement rhetoric about GDP. I have a bigger GDP than yours. I mean, so, and this is true. I mean, there is a serious study about this. So, and we are still, and also there is another problem that GDP comes very timely. You know, you can have GDP every 3 months. So, why you cannot have a quality of life measure so timely, you know, and so detailed. So what can be done? I mean, it's really difficult. I need you have to work on two main things. First, improve the research, this always. So improve the evidence, improve the body of research that says that these measures are really important. Second, it's important to do another kind of work that is networking. I mean, we mainly got this result, we mainly got this law in the parliament because we managed to network and to raise the interest in some politicians that made the case in the parliament and push forward this law. This, if you don't lobby in the good sense of the term, you won't get any result. And I think the last thing is education. I mean, educate the more possible to teach the people that have to see the life in through the lens of complexity, because otherwise they will miss everything. I don't have a recipe for this. I mean, I think mainly these are the three important aspects. So methodologically improve the research, make the statistics more timely, more comparable, more adapt to the reality, networking, and try to create a consensus and educate the people.
Yeah, that's very handy. I mean, I think they will go together because lobbying or advocacy requires the evidence base in order to make the argument. So there's a very close relationship between them. Yeah. Are there other questions?
I was just going to ask, the perception that we have is, say, the Scandinavian countries have better well-being. So is there any way in which that you can relate that? That can offer some support for the view that, you know, this is what evidence said, you can draw on from their experience of how they do things, and that has resulted in increase.
I have to be careful what I say now. WHO Europe headquarters in Copenhagen. We have discussions about this quite often, about what the Danes regularly rate themselves as having the highest levels of life satisfaction. But it's countered by the fact that they also have one of the highest suicide rates, if not the highest suicide rate in Europe. Now, I'm not saying, I don't know how they're related, if they are related, but it immediately brings into play precisely those cultural factors, because there are very different very large differences in the ways that different nationalities rate themselves because of certain cultural expectations and cultural aspirations. So the score then becomes deeply problematic because the way that Italians rate themselves because of their culture and how they, even what the numbers mean, is very different from the ways in which in Denmark those numbers are attached to certain meanings. And actually it's a really good example of that, because that does get you straight into how it is we measure, what do the numbers mean, what are the cultural specificities, are they happier in Denmark, and how do you equate that with various other factors that suggest that they might not be, that they rate themselves as. Now, that's all very carefully put, that's all allegedly. I don't know, but it's actually, that example is one of the ones that does open up all this question that Giovanna was asking earlier about the concerns we have about well-being. Actually, that example is a really key one that raises questions more perhaps than it answers, precisely because of the cultural dimensions of it. So it's a really interesting example, that, and there may be ways in which you can tie those well-being, self-reported well-being to various structural state structures in relation to taxation, in relation to income, in relation to lots of other things, but it's complicated by the fact that those scores are really culturally determined, I think. Is that fair to say, Felicity?
Very well put.
Good.
I also would like to add something on this. We should avoid to make the same mistake with life satisfaction that we did with GDP.
Yes.
So stop focusing on the fact that I have 7, you have 6.8,
Yes,
because it's the same problem, that this means nothing,
Yeah.
really means nothing. And the narrative that we have to try to build using this body of data on well-being is a narrative that is mainly focusing on critical points and strong points. So which are the vulnerability, which are the resilience aspect of a society. So we are mainly trying to do this. So we know that, for example, in Italy, the employment, especially the women employment, is a weak point. We know that, for example, education attainment is a weak point. You have to work in this way, try to build a narrative on what you should do to improve the situation of the Italian well-being. From this point of view, life satisfaction is important only in the sense that can ring a bell on very dangerous situations. So I make just one case. We had the economic crisis in 2008. Life satisfaction in 2008 was not affected. 2009 was not affected. 2010, it dropped something like 4 points. That for life, 2 point something points. Life satisfaction usually moves 0.1, 0.2 points like this. This why? Why after 2 years? Because the first 2 years, the people in Italy, we save a lot, and also we have the family to protect us a little bit. So the first 2 years, the people were saying, okay, it's a crisis, it will finish. So I have savings. The second year, they said, oh my God, it's not yet finished, but maybe we have hope. The third year, the 2010, the people lost the hope, and then the life satisfaction dropped. This means that at that point, either you do something or you risk the collapse of the society. So you have to use in this way. If you use just to say, Lombardia is 7 and Campania is 6.5. This you can do with everything. You can do with regional GDP, you can do with employment rate, doesn't mean anything. So that's why I'm saying you have to connect the things, and you need to build a narrative from different point of view to say something that can really be a suggestion to the politician. Later on, the politician can use or not. This is not your business anymore. Partially, but.
Well, it's an interesting point about going back to Kuznets about how GDP or life satisfaction can be manoeuvred and massaged for political purposes. So in Italy, you say after the economic crash, you say the politician can say, actually, we're fine. Life satisfaction is fine. So you can use that in ways for a political narrative that can completely suppress what is happening in people's lives, and GDP did that, and you're right that there is a risk that life satisfaction does it. There's certainly concerns about politics of happiness, for example, in many countries, and what that narrative is doing for political purposes. So I think it's some really good, very, very useful.
I mean, there was a work done by the OECD, but there was no follow-up on this work because it's difficult to use these indicators, I mean, the well-being indicators, generally speaking, to identify possible tipping points in the societies. So if the employment rate drops so very much and life satisfaction drops so much, be careful, there could be a revolution of that country, or could be a destabilization of the society, can be, I don't know.
So a mechanism for predicting or anticipating challenges or problems.
This is very difficult, but for sure you can use this indicator to identify very vulnerable groups. So for example, in Italy, we not only have the classical indicator on relative poverty, but we also use an indicator of absolute poverty that we build using the consumption data. And we know that in Italy there is a problem of increase in poverty, but we know that one of the specific problems of Italy is the children living in a poor family. And this is a specific problem, and ISTAT has been talking more than 10 years that there is a specific problem, because when you are children and you live in poverty, it's the end of your perspective, because you cannot, I mean, or let's say your access, the possibility where you can access are much less. And for 10 years, the parliament did nothing. I mean, but this doesn't mean that you don't have to keep insisting on building narrative to underline what you think are the specific problem of the Italian society. And on this also the academia can do something, because the data are available, and the ISTAT can say, look, we think the problems are these. The researchers can also, make the effort and underline aspects that maybe are not seen by ISTAT or are, under-evaluated, and so on and so forth.
We're at 4 o'clock. Kerry, did you get any activity online? In which case, shall we draw it to a close? Adolfo, Mauro, thank you very, very much. It's lovely that you came over, Adolfo. We deeply appreciate it. Because we are in the process of developing this, and Mauro is developing it, it's really helpful, really lovely to have somebody with your experience to come and help us talk through some of these things. So could we thank Adolfo and Mauro, and keep an eye out for seminars. I can't remember when the next one is. March? Loneliness?
March 22nd, isolation and loneliness, and it will be here in this room.
Good. Which takes us on very nicely from some of the things we're saying about social relations and goodness knows what. So in here, March 22nd. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
Thank you.